Little House on the Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Book 5 by the Shores of Silver Lake. Chapter 28, Moving Day.
"Wake up, sleepyhead," Laura sang out, and with both hands she rolled Carrie back and forth under the quilts. "It's moving day. Get up quick. We're moving to the homestead." Quickly, they all ate breakfast, wasting no time in talk, and quickly Laura washed the dishes and Carrie dried them, while Ma packed the last box and Pa hitched up the team. This was the gladdest moving day that Laura had known. Ma and Mary were glad because this was the end of traveling. They were going to settle on the homestead and never move again. Carrie was glad because she was eager to see the homestead. Laura was glad because they were leaving town. Pa was glad because he always liked moving, and Grace sang and shouted in gladness because all the others were glad. As fast as the dishes were wiped, Ma packed them in the tub so they would ride safely. Pa loaded the trunk and the packed boxes and the tub of dishes into the wagon. Then Ma helped him take down the stovepipe, and they put it in the stove into the wagon box. He laid the table and the chairs on top of all, and then he looked at the load and tugged his beard.
"I'll have to make 2 trips so we can all ride," he said. "Get the rest of the stuff ready and I'll be back."
"But you can't unload the stove by yourself," Ma objected.
"I'll manage," said
Pa.
"What goes up must come down, and I'll rig up some skids. There's lumber out there."
He climbed into the wagon and drove away. When Ma and Laura rolled the bedding into tight rolls, they took down Ma's big bedstead and the 2 smaller new bedsteads that Pa had bought in town, and they packed the lamps carefully in a box, right side up, so they would not spill the kerosene. They stuffed the lamp chimneys with paper and wrapped them in towels and packed them beside the lamps. Everything was ready and waiting before Pa came back. He put the bedstead and the boxes in the wagon and laid the rolls of bedding on them. Then Laura handed him the fiddle box, and he tucked it carefully among the quilts. On top of all, he laid the whatnot on its back so that it would not be scratched. Then he brought Ellen and tied her behind the wagon.
"Now, Caroline, up you go."
He handed Ma over the wagon wheel to the spring seat.
"Catch!"
And he tossed Grace into Ma's lap.
"Now, Mary,"
he said gently, and he helped her to the board laid close behind the seat, while Laura and Carrie clambered to their places beside her.
"Now then," said Pa, "we will soon be home."
"For pity's sake, Laura, put on your sunbonnet," Ma exclaimed. "This spring wind will ruin your complexion." And she pulled Grace's little bonnet farther forward to protect her fair, soft skin. Mary's face was far back in her bonnet, and so was Ma's, of course. Slowly, Laura pulled up her own bonnet by its strings from where it hung down her back, and as its slatted sides came past her cheeks, they shut out the town. From the tunnel of the bonnet, she saw only the green prairie and blue sky. She kept on looking at them while she held onto the back of the spring seat and joggled to the wagon's jolting over the wind-dried ruts of mud. While she was looking, suddenly into the sunny green and blue came 2 brown horses with flowing black manes and tails, trotting side by side in harness. Their brown flanks and shoulders gleamed in the sunshine. Their slender legs stepped daintily, their necks were arched and their ears pricked up, and they tossed their heads proudly as they went by. "Oh, what beautiful horses!" Laura cried. "Look, Pa, look!" She turned her head to watch them as long as she could. They drew a light wagon. A young man stood up in the wagon, driving, and a taller man stood behind him with a hand on his shoulder. In a moment, the backs of the men in the wagon loomed up so that Laura could no longer see the horses. Pa had turned around in the seat to watch them too.
"Those are the Wilder boys," he said. "Almanzo's driving, and that's his brother Royal after him. They've taken up claims north of town, and they've got the finest horses in this whole country. By George, you seldom see a team like that."
With all her heart, Laura wished for such horses. She supposed she never could have them. Pa was driving south now across the green prairie and down a gentle slope toward Big Slough. The ranker, coarse grass of the slough filled its straggling hollow, and up from a water pool flapped a heron with dangling long legs. How much do they cost, Pa? Laura asked.
What, Flutterbudget?
Said Pa. Horses like those?
A matched team like that? Not a penny under $250. Maybe 300,
said Pa.
Why?
Nothing. I was just wondering, Laura replied. $300 was so much money that she could hardly imagine it. Only rich people could pay such a sum for horses. Laura thought that if ever she were rich, what she would have would be 2 sleek brown horses with black manes and tails. She let her bonnet fly back in the wind and thought of riding behind such fast horses. Far to the west and south, Big Slough widened and spread. On the other side of the wagon, it ran narrow and marshy to the narrow tip of Silver Lake. Quickly, Pa drove across the narrow part and up to the higher ground beyond.
There it is,
he said. The little claim shanty stood bright in its newness in the sunlight. It looked like a yellow toy in the great rolling prairie covered with rippling young grass. Ma laughed at it when Pa helped her from the wagon. It looks like half of a woodshed has been split in 2.
You're wrong, Caroline,
Pa told her.
It is a little house, only half built and that half unfinished. We'll finish it now and build the other half soon.
The little house and its half a slanting roof were built of rough boards with cracks between. There were no windows and no door for the doorway, but there was a floor, and a trap door in the floor opened into a cellar.
I couldn't do more than dig the cellar and put up rough walls yesterday, said Pa. But now we're here. Nobody can jump our claim, and I'll soon fix things up for you, Caroline.
I'll be glad to be home, Charles, said Ma. Before sunset, they were all settled in the funny little house. The stove was up, the beds were made, the curtain was hung to make 2 tiny rooms of the one small room. Supper was cooked and eaten, the dishes washed, and darkness was falling softly on the prairie. No one wanted the lamp lighted, the spring night was so beautiful. Ma sat gently, rocking by the doorless doorway, holding Grace in her lap and Carrie close beside her. Mary and Laura sat together on the threshold. Pa sat just outside the doorway in a chair on the grass. They did not talk. They sat looking while stars came out one by one and frogs were croaking in the big slough. A little wind was whispering. The darkness was velvety soft and quiet and safe. All over the huge sky, the stars were twinkling merrily. Then Pa said softly,
I feel like music, Laura.
Laura brought the fiddle box from its safe place under Ma's bed. Pa took the fiddle from its nest and tuned it lovingly. Then they sang to the night and the stars. Oh, drive dull care away, for weeping is but sorrow. If things are wrong today, there's another day tomorrow. So drive dull care away and do the best you can. Put your shoulder to the wheel is the motto for every man. I'm going to put up the little shepherdess just as soon as the roof is finished over our heads, said Ma. Pa's fiddle answered her with little notes running like water in the sunshine and widening into a pool. The moon was rising. The creamy light crept up the sky and the stars melted in it. Cool and silvery, the moonlight lay over the wide, dark land, and Pa sang with the fiddle softly. When the stars are brightly beaming and the sighing winds are still, when the twilight shadows hover o'er the lea, there's a tiny candle gleaming from the cottage 'neath the hill, and I know that little beacon shines for me.
Little House on the Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Book 5 By the Shores of Silver Lake. Chapter 29 The Shanty on the Claim. The first thing to do is to dig a well, said Pa next morning. He shouldered his spade and shovel and went whistling toward the slough while Laura cleared the breakfast table and Ma rolled up her sleeves. Now, girls, she said cheerfully, all together with a will, and we'll soon have things to rights. But even Ma was puzzled that morning. The little claim shanty was as full as it would hold. Everything must be carefully fitted into the space.
Laura and Carrie and Ma lifted and tugged the furniture this way and that, and stood and thought and tried again. Mary's rocking chair and the table were still outdoors when Pa came back.
Well, Caroline, your well's all dug,
He sang out.
6 feet deep and good cold water and quicksand. Now I'll hammer together a cover for it so Grace can't fall in, and that'll be done.
He looked at the disorder and pushed back his hat to scratch his head.
Can't you get it all in?
Yes, Charles, said Ma. Where there's a will, there's a way. It was Laura who thought how to fit in the beds. The trouble was that they now had 3 bedsteads. When they stood side by side, there was not room for Mary's rocking chair. Laura thought of setting the little bedsteads together tight in the corner and putting the foot of the big bedstead against them with its headboard against the other wall. Then we'll hang a curtain around our beds, she said to Ma, and another curtain across besides yours, and that leaves room for the rocking chair against your curtain. That's my smart girl, said Ma. Against the foot of Laura's and Mary's bed, the table fitted under the window that Pa was sawing in that wall. Ma's rocking chair went in beside the table, and the whatnot fitted in that corner behind the door. In the 4th corner stood the stove, with the dish cupboard made of a packing box behind it, and the trunk fitted between the stove and Mary's rocking chair. There, said Ma, and the boxes will go under the beds. It couldn't be better. At dinner, Pa said,
Before night, I'll finish this half of a house.
And he did. He put in a window beside the stove to the south. He hung in the doorway a door bought from the lumber yard in town. Then all over the outside of the shanty he put black tar paper, fastening it down with lath. Laura helped him unroll the wide, black, tarry-smelling paper down over the slanting roof and the walls of fresh, clean, pine-scented boards, and she helped him cut it and held it down in the wind while he nailed on the lath. Tar paper was not pretty, but it stopped all the cracks and kept out the wind.
Well, there's one good day's work done,
Pa said when they sat down to supper. Yes, said Ma, and tomorrow we'll finish unpacking and be finally settled. I must do a baking, too. There's a blessing to have yeast once more. I'll feel as though I never want to see another sourdough biscuit.
Your light bread is good, and so is your sourdough biscuits, Pa told her. But we won't have either if I don't get rustling something to bake them with. Tomorrow I'll haul a load of wood from Lake Henry.
May I go with you, Pa? Laura asked. Me too, Carrie begged.
No, girls, said Pa. I'll be gone quite a while, and Ma will need you.
I wanted to see some trees, Carrie explained. I don't blame her, said Ma. I would like to see some trees again myself. They would rest my eyes from all this prairie with not a tree, not even a bush to be seen in any direction.
This country's going to be covered with trees, Pa said. Don't forget that Uncle Sam's tending to that. There's a tree claim on every section, and settlers have got to plant 10 acres of trees on every tree claim. In 4 or 5 years, you'll see trees every way you look.
I'll be looking in all directions at once then, Ma smiled. There's nothing more restful than shady groves in the summertime, and they'll break the wind, too.
Well, I don't know,
said Pa.
Trees spread, and you know what it was like back in the big woods of Wisconsin, grubbing out stumps and breaking our backs on the sprouting hoe to keep a little land cleared for crops. It's restful to have clear prairie land like this if you're going to farm, but Uncle Sam don't seem to look at it that way, so don't worry, Caroline. You're going to see plenty of trees all over this country. Likely they'll stop the wind and change the climate too, just as you say.
They were all too tired for music that night. Soon after supper, they were all asleep, and bright and early next morning, Pa drove away toward Lake Henry. The whole world was gay in the early sunshine when Laura led Ellen to drink at the well. All over the prairie, the little white blossoms of wild onion were dancing in the wind. Down the slope of the little hill below the shanty, patches of wild crocus spread yellow and blue in the young grass, and everywhere the sheep sorrel uncurled its little pink lavender flowers over sleek clover-shaped leaves. Laura bent down to pick them as she walked and slowly nibbled the delightfully fresh, sour little stems and petals. From the grassy swell where she picketed Ellen, she could see the town beyond to the north. Big Slough curved between and spread wide southwest, covering acres upon acres with its rough, high grass. All the rest of the whole enormous prairie was a green carpet flowered with spring blossoms. Big girl as she was, Laura spread her arms wide to the wind and ran against it. She flung herself on the flowery grass and rolled like a colt. She lay in the soft, sweet grasses and looked at the great blueness above her and the high, pearly clouds sailing in it. She was so happy that tears came into her eyes. Suddenly she thought, "Have I got a grass stain on my dress?" She stood up and anxiously looked, and there was a green stain on the calico. Soberly, she knew that she should be helping Ma, and she hurried to the little dark tar paper shanty. "It's tiger striped," she said to Ma. "What is, Laura?" Ma asked, looking up startled. She was putting her books on the bottom shelves of the whatnot. "This shanty," said Laura, "striped with yellow lath on the tar paper." "Tigers are yellow with black stripes," Mary objected. "You girls unpack your boxes now," said Ma. "We'll arrange all our pretty things on these upper shelves." On the shelf above the books, there was room for Mary and Laura's and Carrie's little glass boxes. Each box had frosted flowers on its side and colored flowers on the lid. The three made that shelf all bright and gay. Ma stood the clock on the fourth shelf, its bright wooden case spread up in a curved lacy pattern from its round glass face, and behind glass painted with gilt flowers, its brass pendulum wagging to and fro, tick-tock, tick-tock. On the smallest, very top shelf above the clock, Laura set her white china jewel box with the tiny gold cup and saucer on its top, and Carrie put beside it her brown and white china dog. "It's very pretty, I'm sure," Ma approved. "When the door is shut, the whatnot quite dresses up the room. Now for the china shepherdess." Then she looked around quickly and exclaimed, "Mercy! Is my bread sponge risen already?" The bread sponge was lifting the lid of the pan. Ma hurriedly floured the breadboard and kneaded the dough. Then she got dinner. She was putting the pan of light biscuits in the oven when Pa came driving the wagon up the hill. Behind him, the wagon box was piled high with willow brush that he had brought for summer fuel, for there were no real trees at Lake Henry.
"Hello, Flutterbudget. Let dinner wait, Caroline," he called. "I've got something to show you as soon as I picket the team."
Quickly, he slipped the harness off the horses and dumped it across the wagon tongue. He hurried the horses away to their picket ropes and came hurrying back. Then he lifted a horse blanket from the front of the wagon box.
"There you are, Caroline," he beamed. "I covered them so they wouldn't dry out in the wind."
"What, Charles?" Ma and Laura craned to see into the wagon box, and Carrie climbed up at the wheel. "Trees!" Ma exclaimed. "Little trees!" Laura shouted. "Mary, Pa's brought little trees."
"They're cottonwoods," Pa said. "They all grew from seeds of the lone tree that we saw across the prairie when we were coming out of Brookins. It's a giant of a tree when you get close to it. It's seeded all along the edge of Lake Henry. I dug enough of these seedlings to make a windbreak clear around the shanty. You're going to have your trees growing, Caroline, quick as I can get them set in the ground."
He took his spade out of the wagon and said,
"The first one's your tree, Caroline. Pick it out and tell me where you want it."
"Just a minute," Ma answered. She hurried to the stove and shut its draft and set back the pot of potatoes. Then she picked out her tree. "I want it right here by the door," she said. With his spade, Pa cut a square in the sod and lifted the grass. He dug a hole and loosened the soft soil until it was fine and crumbly. Then carefully he lifted the little tree and carried it without shaking the earth from its roots.
"Hold the top straight, Caroline," he said.
Ma held the small tree straight by its top, while with his spade, Pa sifted earth over its roots until the hole was filled. Then he stamped the earth down firmly and stood back.
"Now you can look at a tree, Caroline, your own tree. We'll give each one of them a pailful of water after dinner. But first we'll get their roots in the ground. Come, Mary, it's your turn next."
Pa dug another hole in a straight line with the first. He brought another tree from the wagon, and Mary carefully held it upright while Pa planted it. That was Mary's tree.
"Yours is next, Laura," said Pa. "We'll make a square windbreak all around the house. Ma's tree and mine by the door, and a tree for each you girls on each side of ours."
Laura held her tree while Pa planted it. Then Carrie held hers. The 4 little trees stood up straight from the patches of dark earth and the grass.
Now Grace must have hers, said Pa. Where's Grace?
He called to Ma.
Caroline, bring Grace out here to plant her tree.
Ma looked out of the shanty. She's out there with you, Charles, she said.
I guess she's behind the house.
Oh, I guess she's behind the house. I'll get her, Carrie said, and she ran calling, Grace! In a minute, she came back from behind the shanty, her eyes large and scared, and the freckles standing out from her pale face. Pa, I can't find her. She must be close by, said Ma, and she called, Grace! Grace! Pa shouted too,
Grace!
Don't stand there. Go look for her, Carrie. Laura, go, Ma said. She exclaimed, The well! And ran down the path. The cover was on the well, so Grace had not fallen into it.
She can't be lost,
Pa said. I left her outdoors. I thought she was with you, said Ma.
She can't be lost, Pa insisted. She wasn't out of my sight a minute.
He shouted,
Grace! Grace!
Laura ran panting up the hill. She could not see Grace anywhere. Along the edge of the big slough toward Silver Lake she looked, and over the flowery prairie. Quickly, quickly, she looked again and again, seeing nothing but wild flowers and grasses. Grace! Grace! She screamed. Grace! Pa met her on the slope as she ran down, and Ma came up gasping for breath. She must be
in sight, Laura, Pa said. You must have missed seeing her. She can't be.
Terribly, he exclaimed.
The big slough!
He turned and ran. Ma ran after him, calling back, Carrie, you stay with Mary. Laura, look for her. Go look. Mary stood in the doorway of the shanty, calling, Grace! Grace! More faintly from Big Slough came Pa's shouts and Ma's, Grace, where are you? Grace! If Grace was lost in the Big Slough, how could anyone find her? The old dead grass stood higher than Laura's head, over acres and acres, for miles and miles. The deep mud sucked at bare feet, and there were water holes. Laura could hear, where she stood, the sound of the coarse slough grass in the wind, a muffled sound that almost smothered even Ma's shrill call, Grace! Laura felt cold and sick. Why don't you look for her? Carrie cried. Don't stand there. Do something. I'm going myself. Ma told you to stay with Mary, said Laura, so you'd better stay. She told you to look, Carrie screamed. Go look, Grace, Grace! Shut up, let me think, Laura screeched, and she started running across the sunny prairie.